Christmas Eve. A five-star restaurant in the middle of Manhattan, half empty, draped in soft gold light, and the quiet hum of holiday music no one was really listening to. Olivia Hartley sat alone at a table set for two untouched wine glass across from her empty chair facing her like an accusation. She had been stood up. Not for the first time. But tonight felt different, heavier, the kind of silence that doesn't just fill a room, it follows you home. She was reaching for her coat when the door opened and a man walked in. Underdressed, out of place, and completely unbothered by it. He looked around the room, once, then walked directly to her table, as if he had already known exactly where she would be sitting. "Mind if I sit?" he said. And for a reason, Olivia said yes. The restaurant was called Aurelian, 42nd floor, Midtown Manhattan, the kind of place where the menu had no prices, and the waitstaff moved like they had been rehearsed. On any other night, Olivia Hartley would have felt at home here. She had closed her first major acquisition at a table 3 rows from where she was sitting now. She had signed the merger that doubled her company's valuation over a dinner that cost more than most people's monthly rent. This building, this altitude, this quiet, it had always been hers. Tonight, none of it felt like hers. The chair across from her had been set with full silverware, a folded napkin, a water glass that had been refilled twice by a waiter, who clearly did not know what to do with the situation. Marcus, the man she had been seeing for 7 months, had texted her at 6:43 in the evening. Not called. Texted. 3 lines, clean and efficient, the kind of message that had clearly been drafted more than once. He said he thought they wanted different things. He said he was sorry. He said he hoped she had a good holiday. Olivia had read it once, set her phone face down on the table, and ordered the tasting menu anyway. She was not going to cry over a man who ended things by text. She was not going to cry at all. What she had not expected was how loudly the empty chair would speak. It sat across from her, like a mirror showing her exactly what the last 7 months had actually been. Not a relationship, an arrangement. Marcus had wanted access to her world, her network, her name at the right events. She had wanted something she hadn't been able to name at the time, something that lived underneath all the control and the quarterly reports and the back-to-back board meetings. She understood now, sitting in the candlelight with a glass of Burgundy. She was not tasting that what she had wanted was simply for someone to stay. Not because of what she could offer, just because they wanted to. No one had ever stayed for that reason. Olivia had built Hartley Meridian from a Series B startup into a $2.3 billion logistics and technology firm in under 12 years. She had a penthouse on the Upper West Side, a driver named Gerald, who never asked questions, and a calendar so full that her assistant had once told her she was booked through the following March. By every visible measure, her life was exactly what she had designed it to be. That was the part no one talked about, the designing of it, the way she had built walls so well constructed that she had eventually forgotten they were walls at all and begun to call them standards. She picked up her coat from the empty chair. She was going to leave quietly the way she did everything without making it anyone else's problem. That was when the front door opened. He came in from the cold, without a reservation, without a jacket that belonged in a room like this one, and without any visible awareness that he was out of place. The hostess moved toward him immediately, her expression professionally neutral, but her posture already forming a wall. Olivia watched from across the room as the woman said something low and firm, the way staff in places like this were trained to refuse, without using the word no. The man listened. He didn't argue. He didn't show any frustration. He just looked past her, scanning the room slowly, and when his eyes reached Olivia's table, they stopped. He held her gaze for a moment, long enough to be deliberate, not long enough to be threatening. Then he said something else to the hostess, who shook her head once more, and he walked past her anyway. Olivia should have flagged the waiter. She should have looked back down at her phone or signaled for the check. Every instinct she had trained told her this was the moment to disengage. Instead, she watched him cross the room. Not rushed, not arrogant, just purposeful, like a man who had made a decision and was following through with it. He stopped at her table. Up close, he was somewhere in his mid-30s, maybe older, with the kind of face that had lived through something and hadn't bothered to hide it. There was a cut on his lower lip, almost healed. His coat was dry, but his boots were wet from the street. He was not what this room was built for. He knew it, and didn't care. "Mind if I sit?" he said. There was no logic to what happened next. There was only the fact that when he asked something in her, recognized the question as genuine, in a way that Marcus's 7 months of carefully performed interest had never managed to be. "You were about to leave," the man said. It was not a question. "I was," Olivia said. "But you didn't." She looked at him steadily. "You walked through a hostess and crossed a dining room. It seemed worth finding out why." He reached for the water glass that had been set for Marcus and poured himself a drink from the carafe on the table, completely unbothered by the fact that it had been placed there for someone else. He drank, set the glass down, and looked at her the way people rarely looked at her anymore. Not with admiration, not with calculation, just with attention. "I'm Adrian," he said. "Olivia." He nodded once, like her name confirmed something he had already been thinking. She didn't like that. She also didn't look away. The waiter appeared at the edge of the table, uncertain about the new occupant of the chair he had been maintaining all evening. Olivia watched the young man's eyes move between her and Adrian, the quiet arithmetic of who belongs and who doesn't, and she felt something tighten in her chest. She recognized the calculation. She had made it herself hundreds of times in hundreds of rooms. "He's with me," she said. The waiter nodded and retreated. Adrian picked up the menu, looked at it for a moment, and set it back down without opening it. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," Olivia said. "I did it anyway." Something shifted in his expression. Not gratitude, exactly. More like recognition. He leaned back slightly and looked out at the city spread below them, the lights of Midtown blurring soft in the winter mist, the streets 42 floors down full of people who had somewhere to be on Christmas Eve. Olivia had spent a long time making sure she was never one of those people, never dependent on a destination, never waiting for an invitation. And yet, here she was, in a restaurant she could have bought twice over, feeling more like a stranger than the man who had no business being at her table. "Bad night," Adrian said, still looking at the window. "Manageable," Olivia said. He turned back to her. "That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting." Adrian didn't push. That was the first thing she noticed about him, the absence of pressure. Most people, when they wanted something from Olivia, applied force. They maneuvered. They asked leading questions and waited for an opening. Adrian just sat there, quiet and undemanding, like he had all the time in the world. It was disarming in a way she hadn't prepared for, and it made her want, against every reasonable instinct, she had to talk. "I was supposed to be here with someone," she said. "He sent a text." Adrian looked at her. He didn't say anything sympathetic, and he didn't say anything dismissive. He just let the statement exist between them. 12 years building a company," Olivia said, "and I still ended up alone at a table for 2 on Christmas Eve because I trusted someone who was counting my connections instead of counting me." "That's a very clean way of explaining it," Adrian said. "I'm a very clean thinker." "I know," he said. There it was again, the sense that he was not encountering her for the first time in any meaningful sense. Olivia set down her wine glass and looked at him directly, the way she looked at people across a negotiating table when she wanted them to understand. She had stopped being polite. "You said that like you already know something about me," she said. Adrian met her eyes and did not flinch. "I do," he said, "but not tonight." Outside, the city hummed. The candle between them burned low and even. She should have called for the check-controlled exit, clean departure, no unresolved questions left in the room. She had been doing that her whole life, Instead, she reached for her wine glass, leaned back in her chair, and stayed. The conversation did not flow easily. That was the first honest thing about it. Adrian spoke in short, precise sentences, the kind that answered the surface of a question without giving anything underneath it. He told her he was from Philadelphia originally, that he had been in New York for about 4 years, that he worked in operations. When she asked what kind of operations, he said logistics, and said it the way people say something when they want you to hear a word without following up on it. Olivia followed up on it. "What kind of logistics?" she said. "Supply chain, fulfillment, the infrastructure side of things, not the executive side." He looked at her evenly. "The part that doesn't get named in the annual report." She recognized the shape of what he was doing, drawing a line between her world and his, without making it sound like an accusation. It was a skill people developed when they had spent years existing just below the level of visibility that got you a name in a room. She had been that person once a long time ago before Hartley Meridian had become something people recognized. She just hadn't thought about it in a long time. "You said earlier that you know something about me," Olivia said. "I'd like to understand what that means." Adrian looked out at the window again, as if he were deciding something, not whether to tell her, but how much to give her at once. "I used to work for a company called Bridgepoint Logistics," he said. "They were a mid-tier fulfillment contractor out of New Jersey. About 6 years ago, Hartley Meridian acquired a distribution network in the Northeast Corridor and renegotiated the vendor contracts across the board." He said it plainly, without inflection, without the sharpness she might have expected from someone building toward a grievance. Bridgepoint lost the contract. They couldn't absorb the margin compression. Within 8 months, they shut down their Newark facility. Olivia kept her expression neutral. She remembered that acquisition, one of 12 they had executed in the same fiscal year. The Northeast Corridor deal had been part of a broader consolidation strategy, entirely standard, entirely legal, the kind of move analysts called aggressive and shareholders called responsible. She had not thought about the specific vendors they had displaced. She had told herself that was not callousness. It was scale. "You worked at the Newark facility," she said. "I ran it," Adrian said, "for 3 years." That landed differently than she expected. Not a worker who had lost a job, a man who had built something, managed, people been responsible for an operation, and watched it close because a company she ran had decided his facility's margin was no longer worth the contract. Olivia understood on a structural level that this was how markets worked. She understood it less well sitting across from the man it had happened to. "How many people worked there?" she said. 214 at peak," Adrian said. "About 160 when we closed." She did the arithmetic she didn't want to do. 160 people. New Jersey just before the holidays, a facility shutting down. Mortgages, health insurance, people who had counted on a paycheck that stopped coming because of a decision made in a boardroom she had been sitting at the head of. "I didn't target Bridgepoint specifically," Olivia said. Her voice was steady. "The vendor renegotiation was across the entire Northeast portfolio. Dozens of contractors were evaluated." "I know," Adrian said. "That's not why I'm here." She looked at him. "Then why are you here?" He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, and for the first time since he had sat down, she felt the full weight of his attention. Not angry, not performing patience, just present. "Because you never knew," he said. "That's what I kept thinking about. Not that you did it, companies do that kind of thing every quarter, but that somewhere in that building, someone signed off on a decision that ended 160 people's year, and they never once had to look at what that meant. They never had to sit across from it." He kept his eyes on hers. "I just wanted someone in that room to see it, even once." Olivia said nothing. The defense was structurally available to her, she knew it well. The logic of scale, the necessity of optimization, The argument that without those decisions her company would not have grown, would not have been competitive, would not have employed the thousands it currently did. All of it was true. None of it made the number 160 feel any smaller. What she had not expected was the absence of anger in how he said it. She had built her defenses against accusation, spent years developing the ability to stay composed when people tried to make her feel responsible for outcomes that were technically speaking the result of legal business decisions. But Adrian wasn't accusing her. He was just describing what had happened and asking her to sit with the weight of it. And that was somehow worse than anything he could have said with fury. "You didn't come here to sue me," she said. "No, or to threaten anything, or get press." She was thinking out loud, mapping the angles the only way she knew how. "You came to a restaurant on Christmas Eve and found a way to sit across from me, to tell me that my company's decisions had consequences you don't think I ever accounted for." "Yes," he said. "How did you know I'd be here?" Something shifted in his expression. "I've followed Hartley Meridian for 4 years, not obsessively, just enough. Your name comes up in the business press a lot. Your patterns aren't hard to read if you pay attention." He looked at her steadily. "I saw the Aurelian Reservation in a Society column piece last week. You and a +1 Christmas Eve. I took a chance you'd still be here. So it wasn't coincidence. The empty chair, the hostess, the calculated walk across the room. He had planned this not with malice, but with the same deliberate precision she recognized in herself. She should have been angry. Violation of privacy, manipulation of access. She had grounds for all of it. She wasn't angry. She was sitting with the understanding that he was in some structural way very much like her. The thought was not comfortable. The candle had burned lower. The waiter had stopped coming by. The restaurant had thinned out while they had been talking. Most tables cleared, the soft holiday music playing to no one in particular. She became aware of how thoroughly she had stopped thinking about Marcus. "I've made hundreds of decisions like that one," she said quietly. "In 12 years. Acquisitions, renegotiations, restructuring, divestitures. Every one of them had a spreadsheet and a projection and a legal sign-off. I never built a process for understanding what the numbers meant to the people behind them. That wasn't an oversight. It was a choice. I told myself it was the only way to run a company at scale." Adrian listened without interrupting. "I still think you can't run a company by personalizing every structural decision," she continued, "but I think I also used that logic as a door I closed a long time ago and stopped checking behind." She looked up at him. "Is that what you wanted to hear?" "I didn't come here for a specific answer," he said. "I just wanted to see if you were capable of the question." The weight of that settled over her slowly. Olivia understood in the particular clarity of someone who had just been seen through their own architecture that the question she had asked herself was not really about Bridgepoint logistics. It was about the broader shape of the life she had built, the controlled distances, the managed relationships, the careful engineering of a world in which nothing could surprise her and no one could reach her unless she allowed it. And she had allowed it less and less with every year that passed, until the only person left in the room was herself. Marcus had not left because he was a bad person. He had left because there was nothing to stay for. She had made herself unavailable in all the ways that actually mattered, and then been confused by the silence. The loneliness was not something that had happened to her. She had built it, methodically, with the same precision she applied to everything else. Adrian stood, picked up his coat, and put it on without ceremony. He looked at her one more time, not with pity, not with satisfaction, just with the same quiet attention he had carried the entire evening. "I'm not trying to make you feel guilty," he said. "Guilt doesn't change anything. I just needed someone in that company to sit with it, even for one night." He nodded once. "Merry Christmas, Olivia." He walked back across the dining room and out through the front door into the cold. The restaurant settled back into its ambient quiet. The empty chair across from Olivia was empty again, but it no longer felt like an accusation about Marcus. It felt like a mirror she had been handed and had not yet decided what to do with. She sat there for a long time. 160 people, a facility in Newark, a renegotiation she had signed off on between two other agenda items on a Tuesday afternoon in a year when she had also been named to a national business list and renovated the penthouse and stopped calling her sister back as often as she should have. The waiter appeared and asked if she would like anything else. "Just the check," she said. Her voice came out even. Professional. Exactly as trained. But her hands folded on the table in front of her were very still in the way that hands get still when the person they belong to is working very hard not to fall apart. She did not sleep that night. The penthouse was exactly as she had left it, every surface in its designated place, the kitchen clean, the blinds angled to let in a precise amount of morning light when it came. Standing in it at 2 a.m, still wearing her coat, she understood for the first time how much that design had cost her. The apartment was perfect. It was also completely empty of anything that had not been put there by her own deliberate hand. She poured herself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen island and did something she almost never did. She stayed with a feeling without trying to root around it. 160 people. She kept returning to the number, the way you return to a bruise, not because it hurts less each time, but because you need to confirm it's real. Adrian had not told her anything she didn't already understand. He had just removed the distance between the understanding and the reality, and without that distance, the whole architecture of her self-justification looked exactly like what it was, a very clean, very well-constructed way of not being responsible for anything she did not want to be responsible for. The thing was, she had built the same architecture everywhere. In her company, yes, but also in her relationships, her friendships, the slow fading of contact with her sister that she had labeled as mutual drift rather than her own withdrawal. She had been so committed to control that she had confused it with integrity. She had spent 12 years believing that running a company with ruthless precision was the same as running it with purpose. They were not the same thing. She saw that now with a clarity that felt less like an insight and more like a long overdue bill arriving in the mail. Christmas morning came gray and quiet. What she did instead of sitting still was open her laptop and pull up the documentation from the Northeast Corridor acquisition. She had not looked at it in 6 years. Bridgepoint Logistics, Newark, New Jersey. Contract termination in the 3rd quarter of a year she had spent mostly on airplanes, closing 4 other deals in 3 other cities. She read through it for 2 hours. Then she pulled the broader vendor list. Bridgepoint was not the only contractor that had been displaced. There were 11 others across the Northeast Corridor portfolio, smaller operations, most of them shuttered within a year of losing the Hartley Meridian contract. She had known this at the level of a statistic. She had not known it at the level of 11 specific companies, with specific addresses and specific numbers of people who had worked inside them. She made a list. Not for anyone else to see, just for herself. 11 companies. Approximate workforce numbers, locations, timelines. By the time she was done, the gray morning had become a gray afternoon, and her coffee was cold, and she was looking at a document that represented in very simple terms the human cost of a year she had considered one of her best. She did not feel guilty in the way that leads to paralysis. She had never been built for paralysis. What she felt was the specific, clarifying discomfort of someone who has finally looked at the full ledger and understood that the numbers on one side do not cancel out the numbers on the other. The company had grown. People had lost their livelihoods. Both of those things were true. She had been counting only one of them. The first week of January, she called her general counsel and her head of corporate strategy into her office and told them she wanted to establish a transition support fund, direct financial assistance for workers displaced by Hartley Meridian's acquisition and consolidation activity over the past decade. Her general counsel asked if there had been a legal claim filed. Olivia said no. Her strategy head asked if this was in response to regulatory pressure. Olivia said no to that too. There was a moment in the room, the particular quiet of senior executives recalibrating their understanding of a situation, and she let it sit there. "This is not a PR initiative," she said. "It doesn't get announced. It doesn't go in the annual report under social responsibility. It gets funded, it gets administered by an independent nonprofit, and it gets done." She looked at both of them. "I want a proposal on my desk in 2 weeks." The proposal came in 10 days. What followed was not a transformation in the cinematic sense. No single moment of revelation, no press conference, no clean narrative arc she could package into a speech. What followed was work. Slow, methodical, unglamorous work. She spent the first quarter of the new year reviewing the company's current vendor contracts with a framework she had never applied before. Not just margin analysis, but displacement risk, local economic impact, transition support provisions. The changes she was making were not cosmetic, and she did not need them to be understood immediately. She needed them to be real. She also called her sister in February. That conversation lasted 2 hours and was not easy, and did not resolve everything, but it was the first honest one they had managed in several years. And when it ended, both of them had agreed to try again. Olivia hung up the phone and sat at her desk for a long time, understanding that accountability worked the same way whether the context was a billion-dollar corporation or a family that had learned to stop expecting her to show up. She found Adrian in March. It took 3 weeks of careful effort. She moved deliberately because she understood that arriving with the wrong approach would undo everything the conversation in December had opened. She found him through public business records. He had registered a small logistics consulting firm in Brooklyn 14 months after the Newark facility closed, working with mid-tier distribution companies on operational efficiency. The firm had 5 employees. It was the kind of operation she would have barely registered in the peripheral vision of her industry, and it was doing real work for real clients, built by a man who had lost what she had taken from him and rebuilt it without drama. She sent a letter, not an email, a physical letter written by hand on plain paper, no Hartley Meridian letterhead. She told him what she had done since December, the fund, the vendor framework, the contract restructuring. She did not dress it up. She wrote it the way Adrian had spoken to her plainly without performance. She told him she was not writing to be forgiven and not writing to close an account. She was writing because he had come to that restaurant to ask her to see something, and she had seen it, and she thought he deserved to know. She did not expect a response. He called her the following Tuesday. The conversation was shorter than the one they'd had at Aurelian. He asked a few specific questions about the fund, how it was being administered, what the eligibility criteria were, whether it extended to companies outside the Northeast Corridor. She answered each one directly. At the end, he said the framework sounded right, and she said she had a team working to make it better, and he said he believed her. 3 words, no ceremony around them, but she had spent enough time in rooms where people said things they did not mean to understand the difference. They met for coffee in April, a place in Brooklyn, nothing like Aurelian. A counter with stools and a menu written on a chalkboard, and a window looking out onto a street beginning to show the first signs of spring. She arrived first. Adrian came in from the street, spotted her at the counter, and sat down beside her without the loaded deliberateness of December. Just a man arriving for coffee with someone he had something to say to. They talked for over an hour, about the fund sum, about the consulting firm he was building more, about what it actually took to run a supply chain operation at the ground level, the human decisions embedded in every efficiency metric. And she listened in the specific way she had been learning to listen since January, which was not just for the information, but for what the information meant to the person speaking it. Before they left, Adrian said, "You didn't have to do any of this." Olivia set down her coffee cup. "That's exactly why I did it," she said. He looked at her for a moment with attention, with no particular agenda. Then he nodded and they walked out into the April street, and the city was loud and ordinary around them, and nothing about the moment was cinematic or resolved. It was just two people who had looked at something difficult together and were figuring out slowly and without a roadmap what came next. The following December, on a Tuesday evening a week before Christmas, Olivia walked into Aurelian. She had a reservation for 2. She arrived exactly on time, something she had been practicing the discipline of not filling every available moment with readiness of letting some things simply begin when they began. The hostess led her to a table by the window, the same view she had stared at 11 months ago while trying to understand what Adrian had left her sitting with. He arrived 8 minutes later. She watched him cross the room, same unhurried stride, same quality of presence that had no interest in performing itself for the room. He was dressed better than he had been in December, though she suspected that was less about the restaurant and more about the fact that he was no longer a man arriving with something to prove. He sat down across from her, and the waiter came, and they ordered without the weight of everything they had needed to say to each other, because most of it had already been said. What had developed between them over the course of the year was not a romance in the traditional sense. It was not what Marcus had been, the arranged warmth of two people performing compatibility for each other's convenience. It was something that did not have an easy name, built from an unusual starting point, a man who had needed her to see something, and a woman who had finally been willing to. There was respect in it. There was increasingly something that felt like genuine ease, the kind that comes not from pretending the difficult parts don't exist, but from having already sat through them. Olivia looked at him across the table. The candlelight between them was steady and warm, different from the uncertain flicker of a year ago. The city spread out beyond the glass, lit for the season, indifferent and alive. "Different than last year," she said. Adrian looked around the room, then back at her. "A little," he said. She smiled, not the managed boardroom version, but the real one, the one that arrived before she could decide whether to allow it. "I had a table set for 2 then, too," she said. "Just a different reason for the empty chair." "Better reason now," he said. Olivia reached for her wine glass. Outside, 42 floors below, the city hummed the way it always had, without concern for any single person's particular reckoning, without interest in whether she had grown or failed or stayed exactly the same. What mattered was what she had done with the time it had given her, and what she chose to do with the time that remained, and who she was willing to become when no one was watching and there was no spreadsheet to hide behind. She knew the answer to that question now. She was still learning what it looked like in practice, but she was no longer pretending the question didn't exist, and for the first time in a very long time, the chair across from her was not empty.